believe in forgiving or forgetting?
They clinked their wine glasses like Rachel had cured cancer, and my mother, her voice syrupy sweet like a southern aunt who keeps grudges wrapped in linen, actually stood up from her chair just to toast her. To my Rachel, she said, smiling with the kind of pride you reserve for astronauts or women who raise 6 kids on their own while going to night school. Senior partner at 34. My baby girls worked so hard. The whole room echoed with applause. I think even the dog barked. And there I was, halfway through my second deviled egg, quietly realizing that no one at that table had even asked how I was doing. Not once. Not a goddamn word. My mother's dining room smelled like roast chicken, rosemary, and lemon-scented polish, the usual setup for what she calls Sunday family unity, which, for me, always felt more like walking into a courtroom where I've already lost the case. Rachel sat across from me, pristine in a cream blazer like she'd walked straight out of a Ralph Lauren ad. Her engagement ring caught the light with every flick of her perfect little wrist, and I wondered, not for the first time, if she knew just how much she glowed under our mother's gaze. I wondered if she ever noticed that Emily, her older sister, was more furniture than family. It wasn't like I hadn't done anything worth mentioning. That week, I'd landed a new long-term client, an eco-friendly skincare company that could keep my freelance design business afloat for 6 months. I'd fought tooth and nail for that pitch, stayed up 3 nights straight, poured myself into the branding mock-ups. But when I mentioned it softly, in a lull between Rachel's stories about depositions and boardroom drama, Mom nodded vaguely, muttered, "That's nice, dear," and immediately turned to ask Rachel about her firm's expansion to Denver. No one looked at me. No one asked a follow-up. It was as if I'd whispered into a wind tunnel. There's a kind of silence that comes not from the absence of noise, but from the presence of being unseen. I sat there, tasting the dry roast in my mouth, listening to my family laugh around me, and felt something small and feral twitch in my chest. It wasn't rage exactly. Not yet. It was more like an awakening. A click. A realization that this wasn't just one bad lunch. This was a pattern. This was the rhythm of my family, and I'd been dancing along to it for nearly 4 decades, letting them treat me like background music while Rachel took center stage. I excused myself early, claiming I had a deadline. No one argued, and on my way out, I passed the curio cabinet in the hallway. That stupid thing had been there since the 90s, filled with my father's old memorabilia, cufflinks, a silver letter opener from when he'd retired, a brass lighter he never used, but kept polished anyway. I stared at the letter opener for a long moment, its blade dull but elegant, and without thinking too hard, I opened the glass door, slipped it into my coat pocket, and walked out the front door like nothing had happened. It wasn't about stealing. It wasn't even about the letter opener. It was about presence. About finally making space for myself in a house where I had always felt like a guest. That night, I poured myself a glass of cheap Merlot, sat on my creaky couch in my too-quiet apartment, and stared at the opener on my coffee table. My reflection curved along its handle. I wasn't sure what I saw. I just knew that something had snapped. I thought about every Sunday lunch I'd ever attended. Every birthday where Rachel got the big cake and I got the store-bought one because you don't really like sweets, do you, honey? Every Christmas where Mom gave me bath salts and gave Rachel a diamond tennis bracelet because Emily's always been more practical. Every whispered comment, every passive dismissal, every time Rachel got the benefit of the doubt while I got the lecture. It all came back, and it stacked up in my mind like overdue bills. And the truth is, I didn't want revenge, at least not yet. I wanted recognition. But if they couldn't give me that, then maybe I'd take something better. Maybe I'd take control of the story they'd been writing without me. I didn't know what that would look like, not exactly. I just knew that if they weren't going to see me, then maybe I'd make it impossible not to. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't text Rachel congratulations. I didn't answer my mother's passive-aggressive group message that read, "Love you girls so much. So proud of our family." Our family. Right. Instead, I got out of bed around 2 in the morning, still wide awake, opened my laptop, and started typing names. Rachel's colleagues. Her clients. The partners at her firm. And then I started thinking, what would it take to tip a golden pedestal just enough for it to crack? I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was just done pretending I wasn't there. And that's the scariest version of me they'd ever meet. The thing about subtle revenge, the kind that doesn't scream or slam doors or flip tables, is that it slips under the skin like a splinter, small enough to ignore at first, but sharp enough to fester, to itch, to make you question whether it's even there until it suddenly swells into something you can't ignore, and that's exactly how I planned it. I wasn't out for blood. Not then, not yet, but I wanted her to feel something quiet and maddening, something that would spread under her polished surface and make her question if she really did have such a flawless grip on her perfect little kingdom. 2 days after that suffocating lunch, Linda, my mother, though I'm not sure that word has ever felt entirely comfortable in my mouth, sent a message to the family group chat. A digital space usually reserved for updates on Rachel's newest career milestone or passive-aggressive comments about someone's quiet phase. This time, though, the tone was off. It read, "Have either of you seen your father's silver letter opener? It's missing from the cabinet." I know it was just there on Sunday. Of course, I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang in the thread like a half-burnt cigarette, smoldering quietly while Rachel responded first, all breezy confidence and mild concern, saying something like, "Mom, don't stress. Maybe the cleaning lady moved it." And then following up with a laughing emoji, like this wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal, because that letter opener had belonged to our dad, and while Linda never mentioned him much, she kept his things like relics in a museum, untouched, unloved, but never discarded. It was the one object in that whole house that carried weight, and its absence wasn't just a mystery. It was a shift, a tear in her illusion of control. Later that night, Rachel called me. I expected some level of smugness. She never could resist flexing her proximity to Mom's emotions like it gave her some kind of authority over me, but her tone was surprisingly calm, maybe even a little curious. "Hey, Em," she said, dragging out the syllables like she was balancing friendliness and suspicion. "So Mom's kind of spiraling about that silver thing. She thinks maybe you borrowed it or moved it when you left Sunday?" I could hear the smile in her voice, the underlying assumption that of course I didn't take it, because I wasn't bold or clever or interesting enough to do something so deliberate. I just said, "No idea. Maybe it fell behind the cabinet," and she laughed lightly, said she'd pass it along, and hung up like she had more important things to deal with. But the part she didn't see, the part none of them ever see, is that I was already 2 moves ahead. That same day, I'd sent an anonymous email to the ethics officer at Rachel's firm. It wasn't anything too explosive, just a gentle nudge, a single sentence. "You might want to look into Rachel Carter's billing practices." Word is, not everything adds up. I didn't need details. I didn't even need it to stick. I just needed to plant the doubt. In a place like that, doubt can be poison, especially for someone perched as high as Rachel was, because once people start looking for cracks, they usually find them, and even if they don't, the suspicion alone can be enough to loosen the grip. Over the next week, things began to shift. Mom called me twice, which was a miracle in itself, though both times it was thinly veiled interrogation, masked as polite check-ins. "Just thinking of you, sweetheart," she'd say, her voice laced with tension, like she was hoping I'd confess to something she hadn't fully formed a theory about. "You were the last one near the cabinet," she'd mention offhandedly, then quickly switch subjects to a recipe or a neighbor's medical scare, like she was scared to press too hard. I gave her nothing but warm neutrality. I knew it would drive her insane. Meanwhile, Rachel's tone shifted slightly in our brief, forced exchanges. She didn't mention the ethics probe directly. It was far too early for it to land on her desk, if it ever did, but her energy had a different pitch, a stiffness, like someone who was trying to keep control of a situation they didn't fully understand. When she texted me about an upcoming brunch our mother was planning, the message was clipped, efficient, and entirely devoid of her usual condescension. Something was wobbling. I could feel it. And it made me smile in a way I hadn't in months. But here's the part that really got me. At that brunch, which I agreed to attend only to watch the show unfold in person, Mom brought up the missing letter opener again, this time in front of 2 of her friends from church. who were sipping weak mimosas and nibbling on overbaked quiche like extras in some staged version of domestic bliss. "It's just odd," she said, not looking at me directly, but casting her voice in my direction. "Things don't just disappear in this house. Not without someone knowing something." There was an edge in her voice that hadn't been there before. A crack. I looked at her, steady and blank, and said with complete calm, "You sure you didn't misplace it, Mom? You've been forgetting things lately." The look she gave me was ice. Pure, controlled ice. The kind of look that said she knew exactly what I was doing, but couldn't prove a damn thing. And just like that, I had her. I didn't need her to cry or beg or scream. I just needed her to wonder. To second-guess herself. To look around her pristine little world and ask, for the first time in decades, what if I don't know my daughter as well as I thought I did? And as for Rachel, I knew it was only a matter of time before her mask started slipping. All it would take was one more nudge. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But I was in no rush. Let them both twist for a while. After all, I'd been twisting in silence for years. There's a very specific kind of tension that builds in a family where nothing is ever really talked about, where the deepest betrayals wear lace tablecloths and pearls, and where pain is dressed up in niceties and offers of more iced tea. As if politeness could mop up decades of favoritism, as if silence could smooth over bruises that never showed on skin, but lived permanently somewhere between your heart and your stomach. That was the kind of home I was walking into that afternoon, the kind of room where everyone smiled just a little too tightly and every compliment felt rehearsed, like we were all cast in the same bad play, clapping for each other with fingers crossed behind our backs. It was Mom's 62nd birthday, and Rachel, ever the planner, had organized a backyard gathering with catered food, floral centerpieces, and a perfectly frosted two-tier cake with white chocolate roses and a ridiculous Queen Linda topper that made me want to roll my eyes so hard they'd rattle. I arrived late on purpose, not out of rebellion, but because I wanted to see their faces when I walked in without announcing myself, wanted to catch a glimpse of how they existed when I wasn't in the room, and sure enough, I walked in to find Rachel mid-story, her voice high and animated, while Mom beamed at her with that same glow that used to make me feel like a ghost at my own dinner table. They didn't even notice me at first, which honestly wasn't surprising anymore. Eventually someone pointed me out, and Mom turned with a surprised, "Oh, Emily, sweetheart, there you are," as if I'd been missing for days and not just standing 10 feet away, sipping lukewarm lemonade and wondering how many of the guests remembered I was part of this family. I smiled, handed her a wrapped gift I knew she'd never use, a French perfume she'd once told me she was allergic to but that Rachel wore religiously, and watched her feign delight with the grace of a woman who'd mastered performance long before I was born. As we settled into a round of speeches, yes, Rachel had scheduled speeches, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the low buzz of tension that came with knowing I was supposed to say something nice, something sweet, something forgettable, and then sit down quietly while Rachel got a standing ovation for being the golden daughter who always made Mom proud. But I had no intention of playing that part this year. Not anymore. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, held up my glass, and cleared my throat with a gentle smile that probably looked sincere enough to fool half the crowd. To Mom, I began, watching her eyes sparkle with that anticipatory pride, the kind you reserve for daughters who stay inside their box. "You've always been a force," I said, pausing just long enough to make the word force echo. "You taught us to be strong, to fight for what we want, to never let anyone stand in the way of our ambition." Rachel, especially, really took that to heart. A few people chuckled, politely. Rachel froze, her smile twitching just slightly at the corners. "I mean, it takes a special kind of woman," I continued, swirling the wine in my glass as if I were just making casual conversation, to rise so quickly in a firm where discretion is everything. Especially after, everything with Greg. There was a pause, so brief it might have gone unnoticed if the air hadn't suddenly thickened like syrup. One of the older relatives gave a confused little cough. Someone else cleared their throat. Rachel's expression didn't change, but her grip on her champagne flute tightened just enough for me to see the white in her knuckles. Mom blinked. Once. Twice. Her head tilted just barely, like she was trying to understand if she'd heard me right, if the word Greg, a name never mentioned publicly, a name that Rachel had begged me to keep quiet after the affair with her married coworker blew up last year, had actually escaped into the open air of her manicured backyard. Anyway, I said brightly, lifting my glass higher, here's to you, Mom. And to the power of raising daughters who always land on their feet, no matter how slippery the slope. I sat down slowly, deliberately, while the murmurs began to ripple around the table, small and confused and deliciously concerned. Rachel laughed, sharp and hollow, and quickly pivoted the conversation to the cake, which now looked like a gaudy monument to denial. The rest of the party passed in a blur of tension and forced laughter, like a dream everyone wanted to wake from but no one dared acknowledge was happening. Later that evening, as I sat on my couch in the fading light, the letter opener still resting on the side table like a talisman, my phone buzzed. An unknown number left a voicemail, Rachel's firm. A professional voice explained there'd been a preliminary ethics inquiry, and they'd be reviewing recent cases. They weren't accusing anyone, just exploring potential discrepancies flagged by a third-party source. I listened to it twice. Then again. Then I deleted it and poured myself a glass of wine. An hour after that, Rachel texted me. No words, just a single period. A punctuation mark meant to say I know. And I did too. Because it had started. The image was cracking. The perfection she wore like armor was beginning to peel, and even if no one else saw it yet, even if she managed to clean it up before it got messy, she would know. She would carry that fear now. She would look over her shoulder. She would ask herself, every time something felt off, was it Emily? And that's all I wanted. Not destruction. Just doubt. Because sometimes the worst thing you can do to someone who has everything is make them wonder how much of it they really deserve. There's a moment, often small, almost imperceptible, when something that once looked solid begins to show its cracks, when the facade you've relied on for decades, polished and practiced, begins to tremble under its own weight. And no matter how tightly you grip the mask, no matter how many smiles or perfect haircuts or brunch invitations you layer on top, something underneath shifts, dislodges, and refuses to settle back into place, and in the days that followed that birthday toast, that smug little eulogy I delivered to Rachel's spotless image, I began to notice the subtle signs that everything I'd waited so long for was finally, quietly, magnificently unraveling. It started with silence, not the usual brand of polite family quiet where we all pretend things are fine, but a different kind, a hard, brittle silence that hummed in the background of group chats and voicemails. A silence that made room for suspicion to grow like mold in the corners of a room no one cleans anymore. Mom didn't call, not once, not even to fish around for an apology, which was unusual for her because even in the worst of times, she liked to play the peacekeeper, the delicate martyr who always tried to keep her girls close, while never truly noticing that she only ever clutched one of us to her chest. Rachel, for her part, went entirely off the radar, which was not like her either, because she was the kind of woman who liked to control the narrative, to spin things before they could spiral, to shape perception like clay in her perfectly manicured hands. But now she was silent, and that silence spoke volumes. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon, when the clouds were low and thick like a sky heavy with secrets, I got a call from Linda. Her name lit up on my phone screen like a warning flare, and for a long moment, I just stared at it, letting it ring, considering whether to answer or let her sit in her own uncertainty a little longer. But eventually curiosity won, as it often does, and I picked up with a cautious hello, only to be met with a voice so brittle it barely sounded like hers. Emily, she said, then paused, breathing in shakily like she'd been crying. Do you have a few minutes to talk? I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just waited. And into that silence, she poured a story I hadn't expected, not one of confrontation or blame, not even one of accusation, but something closer to desperation. The kind that only seeps in when a person starts to feel their grip slipping on the life they've carefully constructed. She told me she'd had a strange call from someone at Rachel's firm, asking her if she knew anything about an internal audit, if Rachel had ever confided in her about billing irregularities or work stress. They didn't say it was serious, she insisted, her voice rising just slightly. But I could tell. They think something's wrong, Emily. They think something happened. And the worst part? She wasn't calling to ask if I'd had anything to do with it. She was calling because, for the first time in years, she didn't know what to believe. I could hear it in the cracks between her words, the dawning realization that the narrative she'd always clung to, the belief that Rachel was flawless and I was complicated, bitter, too sensitive for my own good, might not be as airtight as she once thought. I didn't give her much. Just vague reassurances that I hadn't heard anything, and a pointed, "I'm sure Rachel will handle it like she always does." I hung up before she could press further, and when I did, I realized my hands were shaking, not from guilt, not from fear, but from something closer to exhilaration. Because now it was real. The needle had been inserted. The infection was spreading. A few days later, while doing a mundane grocery run, picking up coffee filters and frozen spinach and wondering, with a strange sense of calm, whether I was becoming a completely different person or simply peeling back the layers to reveal who I'd always been, I spotted Linda in the parking lot. She hadn't seen me, which gave me the luxury of watching her unnoticed, and what I saw was a woman who looked nothing like the composed, regal mother who always hosted holiday dinners with table runners and matching napkin rings. She looked frantic, unmoored, like someone on the edge of something they couldn't name. She was standing by her car, locked in a hushed but heated conversation with a man I recognized instantly, Greg, the former coworker Rachel had been involved with, the same one who'd nearly lost his job over the affair and who, according to Rachel, had since moved on. But there he was, very much present, very much arguing with my mother in a grocery store parking lot, gesturing wildly as she tried to keep her voice down. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The look on her face told me everything. She was panicking, not just about Rachel's career, but about the image she had spent so long curating, the image that now had visible cracks spreading through it like veins in marble. That night, I printed a series of old voicemails from my phone records, missed birthday calls, unanswered holiday messages, the soft click of her hanging up without leaving a word, and slipped them into a small envelope. I wrote nothing on the outside, just left it tucked under the door mat at her front porch, with a note inside that said, in neat handwriting, proof that silence is louder than you think. I didn't expect an immediate response. I wasn't looking for confrontation. What I wanted was for her to sit with it, to feel the weight of her absence in black and white form, to hear her own voice filtered through the static of years she never noticed slipping past while she focused on Rachel's perfect trajectory. And when the inevitable call came, at 2:05 in the morning, because guilt always wakes the guilty when the world is quietest, I wasn't surprised. But what I didn't expect was that the voice on the other end would be Rachel's, shaky and urgent, whispering through what sounded like muffled sobs, "Emily, Mom's hysterical. What did you do?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit, thick and deliberate, until she said my name again, this time not like an order, but like a plea. And in that moment, sitting there in the blue-lit haze of my living room, with the letter opener still glinting on the side table like a reminder of how this all began, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was about making sure they finally, truly saw me. There's a strange, almost surreal quiet that comes just before impact, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe or settle you, but instead fills your chest with a pressure you can't explain, like the moment before a storm finally breaks open the sky, like the second just before glass shatters on tile or a scream escapes from someone who's held it in for too long, and that was exactly the feeling sitting thick in my chest as I slipped into my coat, slid the USB drive into my purse, and headed out. Into the early hours of a morning that didn't yet know it was about to carry the weight of something irreversible. The air outside was still and dark, one of those false dawns where the world feels suspended, not quite night, not quite morning, just an in-between that mirrors the moment you realize everything's about to change, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Not because you've lost control, but because you've finally decided to let go of pretending you ever had any. Rachel's voice had cracked over the phone in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers, and she wrecked our parents' Volvo trying to sneak out to meet some boy she never even really liked. Back when Mom still treated her mistakes like bumps in the road and mine like full-blown derailments. "Mom's hysterical," she'd said, her words barely getting past the panic. "She's locked herself in her bedroom. She won't stop crying. She says she's been lied to. She thinks she's going crazy. What the hell did you do?" And though I didn't respond immediately, though I let her twist in the silence for long enough to make her repeat the question in a softer, almost broken tone, I knew what she wanted, and I knew I wasn't going to give it to her, not the answer she expected, not the comfort she'd been fed all her life. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to nudge the edges of the sky into a soft gray, casting the house in the kind of dull, shadowless light that made everything feel washed out and tired. The porch light was still on, which meant Rachel hadn't left, and sure enough, her car was parked sideways on the curb like she'd pulled up in a panic and never corrected herself, a small detail that made me smile despite the weight of what was coming. I walked up the path slowly, deliberately, as if every step was an echo of all the times I'd come here before, quiet, expected, forgettable, and this time, finally, I wanted my footsteps to land. Rachel opened the door before I could knock, her face pale and drawn, her eyes ringed with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from the unraveling of a carefully constructed reality. "She won't come out," she said immediately, without greeting, stepping aside like a hostess who doesn't really want her guests to come in but knows she has no choice. "She's been like this since she found that note." The voicemails. "Emily, what is wrong with you?" I didn't answer. I walked past her, into the living room that had hosted so many carefully curated family moments, so many photos staged to tell a story no one ever lived, and I stood there, letting the silence settle around us until Rachel finally snapped. Her voice rising, not angry, not righteous, but panicked. "Why are you doing this now? Why, after all these years, are you trying to break everything apart?" And that's when I turned to her, slow and calm, my voice so even it startled even me, and I said, "I'm not trying to break anything. I'm just refusing to hold it together anymore." She didn't respond. Her mouth opened like she had something to say, something rehearsed maybe, a defense or a counterattack, but nothing came out, and in that silence, I could almost hear the cracks spreading further through the foundation of everything she thought was stable. I moved past her, up the stairs, to the bedroom door that was cracked just enough for the light inside to spill out like a nervous whisper, and I knocked once, gently. "Mom," I said, not sweetly, not cruelly, just plainly. "It's me." Inside, I heard rustling, a sob that had no energy left behind it, and then a slow shuffling of feet before the door opened. Linda stood there in her robe, her hair unbrushed, her eyes swollen and red, and for the first time in my life, she looked like a person, just a person, not the mother I had spent years trying to please or hurt or understand, but a woman who had built her world around a single, fragile belief that love could be tidy, that favorites could be disguised as fairness, that if you just kept smiling, no one would notice what was rotting beneath the wallpaper. She didn't say my name. She didn't reach for me. She just looked at me like someone realizing the mirror has been lying all along. "Why would you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice so soft I had to lean in to hear it. "All I ever did was try to protect you girls." And there it was, that word again. Protect. As if ignoring someone's pain could shield them from it. As if pretending Rachel's wins were our wins somehow made up for never celebrating mine. As if silence, that thick and lonely thing, could ever pass for love. I reached into my purse and held out the USB drive. "These are your words," I said. "Your absences. Your excuses. Every time you forgot, every time you overlooked, every time you brushed past me to reach for her." She didn't take it. She stared at it like it was dangerous, radioactive. "I didn't want to hurt you," I added, and I meant it. "But I needed you to know what it felt like to be erased." There was no resolution. No sudden embrace. No forgiveness. She just turned, slowly, and walked back into her room, leaving the door open behind her but saying nothing more. Rachel appeared at the top of the stairs, arms crossed tightly, her mouth pressed into a line that told me she still didn't understand, and maybe never would. I walked down the stairs, back through the house, out into the morning that was now fully awake, the sky pale and open and wide with possibility. I left the USB on the entryway table, where Linda would have to see it. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. And as I reached my car, I realized something that I hadn't been able to admit until that very moment, not even to myself. This wasn't about making them pay. It was about making sure that from this day forward, they could never again pretend I had nothing to say. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's finally being heard in a room that tried for years to pretend you weren't even there.